A private nurse is hired to take care of a little girl in a vegetative state. One day she sees bruises on the girl's body. They lead her to a horrifying secret. "What a day for this to happen," Susan grumbled under her breath as she climbed out of her old, sputtering car, a thin trail of smoke rising from the hood. She was already on edge. Today marked her first day as a private nurse for the Cooper family, and things were off to a rocky start. After several failed attempts to call for roadside assistance, she finally flagged down a cab, arriving at the estate an hour later than planned. Susan tried to shake off the embarrassment, but it wasn't easy. Ever since she had accepted Mrs. Cooper's offer, it felt like everything in her life had started to unravel. First, her apartment flooded. Then, her car gave out. Was it all just bad luck? Or was it some kind of divine warning urging her to reconsider? As she stepped onto the long gravel drive leading to the Cooper residence, the morning light strained to pierce the thick layer of clouds still hanging low in the sky. Susan smoothed the wrinkles in her blouse, adjusted her nurse's badge, and took a steadying breath. This was just another job, she told herself, trying to summon some calm. Yet the excitement she normally felt when starting something new was nowhere to be found. Instead, a persistent unease settled over her, one she couldn't quite explain. The doorbell's soft chime echoed within the house, followed by hurried footsteps. Megan Cooper opened the door, a pale, thin woman with tired eyes that didn't quite match the forced smile on her face. "Ah, Susan, welcome," Megan said, her voice soft yet strained. She gestured for Susan to come inside, her hand lingering on the doorknob as if reluctant to let go. The entryway was elegant but stark, with walls that whispered of wealth but bore none of the warmth of a family home. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper." "It's a privilege to care for Emily," Susan replied warmly, stepping inside. She clutched her bag a little tighter, catching the tension in Megan's stance. "Please, call me Megan," the woman replied quickly. Her gaze flitted down the hallway. "Dave will want to meet you shortly, but let me show you to Emily first." Megan led Susan through a maze of dark hallways. The walls were lined with family portraits, their frozen smiles an eerie contrast to the oppressive silence of the house. Susan noticed the absence of laughter, the kind of sound one might expect in a family home, replaced by an unsettling quiet that clung to the air. As they entered the room, Susan's breath caught. Emily lay on a hospital bed, her small frame surrounded by the hum and beeps of medical equipment. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, dotted with pastel butterflies and flowers, but the brightness of the decor felt like a cruel jest against the lifeless figure in the center. "She's been like this for almost a year," Megan whispered, brushing a strand of blonde hair from Emily's forehead. Her hand lingered, trembling slightly. "The doctors say she might still hear us, but it's hard to believe sometimes." Her voice faltered and she looked away. "I'll do everything I can," Susan assured her gently. Megan nodded, her shoulders tightening as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Dave Cooper strode into the room, his presence dominating the space before he'd even spoken. A tall man with broad shoulders and an air of authority, his expression was more scrutinizing than welcoming. His eyes fixed on Susan with a sharpness that made her stiffen instinctively. "So, you're the nurse," he said, his tone more a statement than a greeting. "This isn't just babysitting. Emily requires constant attention, and I expect nothing short of perfection." Susan nodded, maintaining her composure. "I understand, Mr. Cooper. I'll treat her with the utmost care." "Good." His eyes shifted briefly to Megan, softening only slightly. "I assume you've explained everything." Megan murmured a yes, but before the tension in the room could settle, Dave turned his attention to the doorway. "Mike!" he barked. A lanky teenage boy appeared hesitantly, his dark hair falling into his eyes. Mike Cooper shuffled into the room, his gaze darting nervously between his father and Susan. "This is Susan, Emily's nurse," Dave said curtly. "You'll stay out of her way. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Mike mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Speak up, boy," Dave snapped, making Mike flinch. "Yes, sir," the boy repeated, louder this time, before retreating to the corner of the room. Susan's stomach tightened at the exchange. Mike's eyes, wide and uncertain, met hers briefly before he dropped his gaze to the floor. As Megan excused herself to guide Susan to her quarters, Mike lingered behind. Susan felt his presence like a shadow, his movements quiet but deliberate. His fingers brushed against the edge of Emily's bed as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. Later, when Megan left Susan alone to settle in, Susan sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. There was something about this family, the stiff smiles, the rigid silences, the way Dave's authority loomed over them all. And then there was Mike, with his restless eyes and hesitant demeanor, like a boy carrying secrets too heavy for his young shoulders. Susan had stepped into the Cooper household with the hope of providing care and comfort. But, as the day's events replayed in her mind, she realized this was a house wrapped in shadows, its inhabitants haunted by things unsaid. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains in Emily's room as Susan gently pulled back the blanket to begin her routine. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like handling porcelain. Emily, so small and fragile, lay still on the hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of the machines. Susan's experienced hands moved to adjust the girl's arm when her fingers froze mid-motion. There, on Emily's pale skin, were faint bruises, scattered like the remnants of some unseen storm. Susan inhaled sharply, her mind racing. She had seen bruises like these before in her years of caregiving, mishandling, or worse. Determined to understand, she stepped out of the room and found Megan in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she chopped vegetables. "Megan," Susan began, her voice low but firm. "I noticed something on Emily's arms this morning, bruises. Do you know how they got there?" Megan's knife faltered, the clatter loud against the cutting board. She glanced at Susan but quickly looked away. "Oh, that. I'm sure it's nothing," Megan murmured, her words unconvincing. "It's probably from physical therapy. It's normal in her condition." Susan watched Megan closely, noting the way she fidgeted with her hands, avoiding eye contact. "Are you sure?" she pressed gently. Yes, it happens," Megan insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just part of her therapy." She turned back to the cutting board, her movements clumsy now, as if the conversation had unsettled her deeply. Susan wanted to push further, but sensed that Megan's reluctance wasn't just avoidance. It was fear, raw and palpable. Later that day, as Susan carried Emily's lunch tray upstairs, she overheard a booming voice from the living room. "I've had enough of your excuses, Megan." Dave's tone was sharp, cutting through the quiet of the house like a knife. She paused, listening from the staircase. "Do you ever stop to think about anyone else in this house?" Dave continued, "I'm the one keeping this family afloat, but all I get in return are complaints." Megan's reply was soft, almost inaudible. "I'm just trying to do what's best for Emily." "For Emily?" Dave snapped, his voice rising. "Don't you dare act like you're the only one who cares about her. Maybe if you spent less time whining and more time being useful, this house wouldn't be falling apart." Susan's chest tightened as she continued up the stairs. She knew she wasn't supposed to interfere, but it was becoming clear that the cracks in this family ran deeper than she had imagined. Later that evening, as Susan cleaned up the kitchen, Mike appeared in the doorway, his lanky frame casting a long shadow on the tiled floor. "Need help with that?" he asked, his voice cheerful, almost too cheerful. Susan smiled cautiously. "Sure, Mike. You can dry these plates." For a while he chatted easily about school and video games, his words flowing with the enthusiasm of any 18-year-old. But just as quickly the energy drained from him. He fell silent, his face darkening like a cloud blocking out the sun. Without a word, he set the towel down and slipped out of the room. Susan found him later that night, standing motionless by Emily's bedside. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on his sister's frail form. "Mike?" she whispered from the doorway, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know if she even knows I'm here." His voice was soft, carrying a weight that seemed far beyond his years. Susan stepped closer, her instincts urging her to offer some comfort. But before she could, Mike turned abruptly and walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the hall. That night, as Susan sat alone in her small room, her mind churned with unease. Megan's anxious deflections, Dave's harsh words, and Mike's erratic behavior painted a troubling picture. The bruises on Emily's arms were more than just marks on her skin. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, one Susan wasn't sure she was ready to solve. But one thing was certain. Whatever darkness lingered in this house, Emily was at the center of it. And Susan knew she had to uncover the truth. No matter how deep, she had to dig. Susan moved slowly across the bedroom, the air heavy and still. She had spent hours cleaning, yet the house always felt untouched. While dusting near Megan's bed, her hand brushed against a floorboard. It shifted slightly under her touch. Susan hesitated. Then she knelt down and gently pried it loose. A journal lay beneath, its green cover faded, corners worn. She stared at it, her hands motionless. The thought of reading it felt intrusive, but something about the hidden book called to her. She opened the first page. The handwriting was small, neat. Megan's words spilled out in calm, steady lines. The first entries spoke of new beginnings. Dave had rescued her, Megan wrote. He had offered her an escape from a cruel first marriage. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She described him as patient, strong, the kind of man she and Emily needed. But as Susan turned the pages, the tone shifted. Megan's words grew hesitant. Dave had changed. She didn't know when it started, but his kindness had faded. He began controlling small things, what she wore, where she went. Then bigger things, money, friends, decisions about Emily. "He says it's for my own good," one entry read, "but it feels like I'm disappearing." Susan felt her stomach tighten as she read. Megan's life had become a cage. The love she once described now felt like a shadow. Halfway through the journal, the words took another turn. Megan began writing about Emily. She noticed how Dave paid her extra attention, how his words softened when they were alone. Megan brushed it off at first. She told herself it was nothing, but sometimes, Megan wrote, I see the way he looks at her, and it makes my skin crawl. Susan froze, her hand gripping the journal tighter. She looked toward the door, her ears straining for any sound. The house was silent. The next pages were worse. Megan wrote about the arguments, how Dave would call her useless, weak, how he would push her aside when she tried to intervene. Then the arguments turned physical. "He slapped me last night," one entry said. "I didn't see it coming. I couldn't even cry in front of Emily." Susan's chest tightened. She could picture it too clearly. Megan's small frame, her shaking hands. Emily watching from the corner, too afraid to speak. There was one line that Susan couldn't stop reading. Sometimes I think he hates us both, but I know he'll never let us go." Susan closed the journal, her hands trembling. Her mind raced with the things she had read. The bruises on Emily, Megan's tired eyes. It all made sense now. She wanted to stop, but something made her keep going. She turned to the final pages. Megan described how isolated she felt. No friends, no money, no options. "He controls everything," Megan wrote. "If I leave, he'll destroy us." Susan sat back, the journal still in her lap. The words felt heavy, like they had anchored her to the floor. She looked around the room at the neat furniture and clean walls. It all felt wrong now. She slid the journal back under the loose board and replaced it carefully. As she stood, her resolve hardened. The truth was clear now. Dave wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. And Emily wasn't safe. Susan left the room, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded, but her mind was set. She couldn't ignore this. She wouldn't. The house was quiet, too quiet. Susan moved carefully, the weight of the phone in her hand heavier than it should have been. She had made up her mind. She couldn't look at Emily's still form, the bruises on her fragile skin, and do nothing. Emily's room was cold, the air thick. Susan glanced toward the door before slipping inside. Emily lay as she always did, her small body unmoving, her face peaceful, yet pale. Susan hesitated, then stepped toward the shelf near the bed. She slid her phone into a small gap behind the books, angling it to see most of the room. Her fingers lingered for a moment. "This will help," she whispered to no one but herself. Then she left as quietly as she had entered. The next morning, Susan retrieved the phone. Her heart was racing as she sat on her bed. She didn't know what she expected, but the feeling in her chest told her she wasn't ready for what she might find. She pressed play. At first there was nothing. The room was still. The machines hummed steadily. Emily lay motionless. Susan let out a breath. She didn't realize she was holding. She fast-forwarded, her eyes scanning the screen. The light in the room flickered. Susan froze. The screen went dark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, movement. A shadow crossed the frame. Susan leaned closer, her breath shallow. A figure appeared, stepping slowly into the room. The dim light made it hard to see details, but the shape was unmistakable. A man. Susan's stomach turned. She watched as he stood by Emily's bed, unmoving. He leaned closer, his hand hovering over her arm. Slowly, he placed it on her skin. Emily made a sound, faint but real. Susan's breath caught in her throat. It was a whimper, soft and weak, but it was there. Even in her state, Emily felt something. Susan stopped the video. Her hands shook as she clutched the phone. She couldn't see his face, but she didn't need to. It was Dave. She was sure of it. The disgust hit her first, then the rage. She felt the bile rising in her throat. How could someone do this? She stood abruptly, gripping the phone like it was the only thing grounding her. She had to confront Megan. Megan was in the kitchen scrubbing a pot. The sound of the metal against the sink was harsh, almost frantic. Susan walked in, her movements stiff. "Megan, we need to talk." Her voice was sharp, louder than she intended. Megan turned, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" Susan didn't hesitate. "I know what's happening to Emily. I saw it." Megan froze, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. "What do you mean?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Susan stepped closer. "Last night, I recorded her room. Someone came in, a man. He touched her, Megan. She reacted. It was Dave, wasn't it? Megan shook her head violently. No, no, you're wrong. Her voice cracked and she turned away. I saw it, Susan insisted. Her anger flared. Don't tell me I'm wrong. You know what he's doing, don't you? Megan covered her face with her hands. You don't understand, she said, her words muffled. You can't say anything. If he finds out… Susan cut her off. If he finds out what? What will he do? Megan, he's hurting her. Megan dropped her hands, her face pale. He'll destroy you, Susan. He'll destroy us both. Susan opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the front door slamming shut stopped her. I'm home! Dave's voice rang through the house. Megan's demeanor shifted instantly. She wiped her face, forced a smile, and turned toward the hallway. Susan, please, she whispered urgently. Not a word. Susan stood frozen as Megan walked away. Hi, honey, Megan said, her voice light and cheerful. You're early. Dave's heavy footsteps filled the space. He entered the kitchen, his eyes sweeping over the room. They landed on Susan, and he smiled faintly. Everything all right here? He asked. Megan nodded quickly. Of course, Susan was just helping me with some chores. Susan clenched her fists. The sight of Megan's forced smile, her quick movements to please him, made her blood boil. She wanted to scream, to shove the phone in his face and demand answers. But she couldn't. Not yet. She had to think. Dave turned to leave, but his presence lingered like a dark shadow. Susan's heart pounded as he disappeared down the hall. Her grip on the phone tightened. She wouldn't let this go. Whatever fear Megan felt, Susan knew one thing for sure. Emily needed her. And she wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. Dave had been watching her. Susan could feel it. Every time she moved through the house, his presence seemed closer, his gaze heavier. He wasn't one for subtlety. When he wanted to intimidate, he made sure you knew it. It happened one evening when the house was quieter than usual. Susan was folding linens in the laundry room, her mind churning over what she'd seen on the video. She didn't hear him enter. Care to explain why you've been snooping? Dave's voice was low, deliberate. Susan froze, her hands gripping the fabric. She turned slowly, her face neutral, though her heart was pounding. I'm not sure what you mean. Dave stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. I've seen you, wandering around, always looking at things that don't concern you. You're here to do a job, Susan. Stick to it. There was no mistaking the threat in his tone. Susan met his stare, refusing to back down. I've been doing my job, she said, keeping her voice steady. Taking care of Emily. That is why I'm here, isn't it? Dave leaned in, his face inches from hers. Don't overstep, he said. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her with trembling hands and a growing sense of danger. The tension in the house was thicker than ever. Every interaction felt charged. Every movement watched. Later that week, the sound of Dave's voice thundered through the house. Susan was in the kitchen when she heard it. You're useless, Dave shouted. Hell, you're not even worth as much as a girl who can't move or talk. Susan's blood ran cold. She crept to the edge of the hallway and peered around the corner. Dave stood, towering over Mike, his face red with fury. Mike's shoulders were hunched, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't say a word, just stared at the floor. Susan felt her stomach turn. The way Dave spoke about Emily, his own stepdaughter, was cruel, almost inhuman. It was another piece of the puzzle, one that made her more certain than ever. Dave wasn't just a threat. He was a predator. That evening, as Susan helped Megan tend to Emily, she saw them, new bruises. They were faint, but unmistakable. Her chest tightened as she gently adjusted Emily's blanket. "She has more bruises," Susan said softly, her voice shaking. Megan froze, her hand hovering over Emily's forehead, her eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her daughter. Susan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Megan, you have to face this. You have to protect her. You can't let this keep happening." Megan broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I don't know what to do," she cried. "He controls everything. If I say anything, if I even try, he'll make us pay." Susan knelt beside her, her voice firm but kind. "You're not alone. I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." Megan looked at her, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I can't lose her. She's all I have." "You won't lose her," Susan promised. Megan hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There's something I've been afraid to admit. I don't think her accident was an accident." Susan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Megan glanced toward the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't add up. She was fine that morning. Then she fell. But I wasn't there. And when I asked Dave, he got angry. He wouldn't let me ask questions. He wouldn't even let her stay in the hospital. He said she'd be better at home." Susan felt the pieces clicking into place. "We need proof," she said. Megan nodded slowly. "But how? He watches everything. He'll know if we try anything." "We'll be careful," Susan said. "We'll document everything. The bruises, the way he talks to her, the way he talks to Mike. We'll find a way to get help." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of their decision sinking in. Megan wiped her face, her hands still shaking. "I'm scared," she admitted. Susan gripped her hand tightly. "I know, but we can't let fear stop us. Emily needs us." From that moment they moved carefully. Every word, every action was deliberate. They couldn't afford mistakes. But Dave was no fool. Susan noticed it first, the way he lingered in rooms longer than usual, the way his questions became sharper. "He knows," Megan whispered one evening, her voice trembling. Susan nodded. "Then we'll be even more careful." But she knew the truth. They were running out of time. Susan sat at the edge of her bed, her head in her hands. The house felt tighter with each passing day, its walls pressing inward, its silence heavy and unyielding. Dave's presence lingered even when he wasn't there. His sharp words, the way he looked at her, all seemed to keep her in check. And then there was Mike. The boy was unpredictable, slipping in and out of rooms like a shadow. His stares, his awkward silences, they unsettled her. Susan tried to make sense of him, but every time she thought she understood, something about him would shift, and she'd feel lost again. Megan wasn't helping. She moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, retreating further into herself. Susan knew the fear that held her back. Megan had lived with it for so long that it was all she knew, but Susan couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to get them out. That night, Susan set the phone to record again. The device had become her lifeline, her only tool to uncover the truth. She placed it in Emily's room as before, adjusting its position before slipping out quietly. The next morning, she retrieved the phone and watched the footage alone. The hours passed uneventfully until Susan noticed movement. She paused the video, her breath quickening. It was Mike. He entered the room slowly, his shoulders hunched, his movements careful. He stood by Emily's bed, staring down at her. Then, without warning, he sank to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice cracked, barely audible over the hum of the machines. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean it." Susan leaned closer, her heart pounding. She watched as Mike buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He was crying. The boy stayed there for minutes, murmuring words Susan couldn't make out. When he finally stood, he glanced around the room, his face pale and drawn. Then he left as quietly as he had come. Susan stopped the video, her mind racing. Mike's words stuck with her. What had he done? What didn't he mean? The guilt on his face, the pain in his voice. It was real. But Susan didn't know what it meant. That afternoon, she made a call. Her friend Clara was someone she trusted deeply. Clara lived out of town and had a small guest house she rarely used. When Susan explained the situation, at least as much as she could, Clara agreed without hesitation. "You bring them here," Clara said firmly. "Whatever they need, we'll figure it out." Susan hung up, a weight lifting off her chest. It was a plan, a way out. She approached Megan that evening, catching her in the kitchen. "Megan, we need to leave," Susan said. Her tone was steady, but there was urgency beneath it. Megan froze, her hands gripping the counter. "Leave?" "Yes. You, me, and Emily. I've found a place. Somewhere safe." Susan stepped closer. "We can't stay here. You know that." Megan shook her head, her face pale. "Susan, you don't understand. If Dave finds out, I know what he'll do," Susan interrupted, her voice rising. "But staying here isn't safe either. Megan, look at Emily. Look at yourself. Do you really think this is living?" Tears welled in Megan's eyes, but she shook her head again. "Emily's too fragile to move. And Dave, he'll kill us, Susan. He'll kill us both." Susan clenched her fists, frustration bubbling over. "So what? You'd rather stay here and let him keep hurting her? Hurting you?" Megan didn't respond. She turned away, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. Susan left the kitchen, her chest tight with anger and despair. She felt trapped, caught between Megan's fear and the danger that loomed over them all. That night, Susan made her decision. She sat at the small desk in her room, pulling out the phone and the journal she had hidden in her bag. The recordings, the bruises, Megan's words, all of it was proof. Susan hesitated, her hand hovering over her phone. Telling the police would change everything. Megan might hate her for it. Dave would know someone had betrayed him. But Emily, Susan, couldn't ignore her. She exhaled slowly, then began to type. She sent everything, the videos, the photos, and a brief explanation, to the local authorities. When it was done, she sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. A part of her felt relief. Another part felt dread. She glanced at the clock. The house was quiet, but Susan knew it wouldn't stay that way. Sooner or later, this choice would bring consequences. But for now, she had done what she could. It was up to them to act. Susan moved swiftly down the hallway, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. The plan was set. She would get Emily ready, and she and Megan would leave this house forever. She carried a small bag with the essentials, medicines, a change of clothes, and clutched it tightly. When she opened Emily's door, the sight stopped her cold. Mike stood by the bed, his posture rigid, his hand reaching toward Emily. He turned quickly when he heard the door. "What are you doing here?" Susan's voice was sharp, her body tense. Mike's face paled. I was just checking on her," he stammered, backing away from the bed. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. What were you doing?" Mike hesitated for a moment, his hand still trembling. Then he bolted for the door. Susan moved to block him, but before she could act, Megan appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" Megan asked, her voice unsteady. She looked from Susan to Mike, her expression shifting to one of fear. "Mike was in here. By Emily," Susan said firmly. Megan's gaze snapped to Mike. "What were you doing, Mike?" she demanded, her tone more forceful than Susan had expected. Mike looked trapped, his eyes darting between the two women. "I wasn't doing anything," he said weakly. "Tell us the truth," Susan pressed. She stepped closer, her voice low but commanding. Mike sank onto the edge of the bed, his hands covering his face. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You don't know what it's like here." "Then explain," Megan said. She crossed her arms, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. After a long silence, Mike finally spoke. His words came out in broken fragments, filled with shame and fear. "It was my fault," he whispered. "Emily fell because of me." Megan's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "She was on the stairs. I didn't mean to scare her, I was frustrated." She tripped and fell. His voice cracked. "I wanted to take her to the hospital. I begged him to take her." Susan's heart sank. "Dave?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Mike nodded, his shoulders slumping. "He wouldn't let me. He said she was better off here. That he could handle it." Megan's voice was sharp. "Why? Why wouldn't he let her go to the hospital?" Mike hesitated, his hands trembling. He said, "If they ran tests, if anyone found out—" He trailed off, his voice choking. "Found out what?" Susan asked, her voice steady but her stomach churning. Mike looked at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. That I hurt her. That I touched her." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Susan felt the room spin for a moment, the weight of the revelation crashing over her. The figure in the video wasn't Dave. It was Mike. Megan stepped back, her hand gripping the doorframe. "You did what?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and fury. Mike's head shot up, his eyes wild. "I didn't mean to. I swear it wasn't like that." Susan stepped forward, her voice cold. "You need to leave. Now." But Megan shook her head, her face pale but determined. "No, he's not leaving. Not until Dave answers for this." The three of them stood in silence until Megan finally turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. Dave was in the kitchen when Megan found him, sipping coffee like it was just another day. "We need to talk," Megan said, her voice firm. Dave raised an eyebrow. "What is it now?" Megan didn't hesitate. "Mike told us everything. About Emily. About why you kept her here instead of taking her to the hospital." Dave's face darkened, but he stayed seated. "He told you, did he?" "Yes, he told us," Susan said, stepping into the room. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched into fists. Dave leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "And what do you think you're going to do about it?" Megan's hands trembled, but she didn't back down. "You let her suffer. You kept her in this house to protect him, to protect yourself. How could you?" Dave's voice was calm, almost mocking. "You think anyone's going to believe you? A hysterical wife and a nosy nanny? This is my house, Megan. You don't make the rules here." Susan took a step forward. "This isn't about your house. This is about what you did to Emily, what Mike did, and we're not staying silent." For the first time, Dave's composure cracked. He slammed his coffee cup onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said through gritted teeth. But Megan's resolve didn't waver. "We know enough," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And we're done letting you control us." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Dave's eyes burned with fury, but Megan held her ground. Susan stood beside her, ready for whatever came next. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. The tension in the room was suffocating. Dave stood in the center of the living room, his face red with anger. His fists were clenched at his sides as he glared at Megan. "You think I would hurt Emily?" he roared. His voice shook the walls. "After everything I've done for this family, you dare accuse me of something so vile?" Megan flinched but didn't back down. Her hands trembled as she held her ground, her voice low and firm. "It's not just me, Dave. Susan saw the video. We both know what's been happening." Dave's eyes darted to Susan, his face hardening further. This is your doing. You come into my house, you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Before he could finish, the sound of sirens broke the standoff. Megan's breath caught as red and blue lights flashed outside the window. A loud knock on the door made the entire room freeze. "Open up! It's the police!" Susan moved first, her legs shaky but determined. She opened the door, letting in 2 officers. Their presence immediately filled the room with authority. "Mr. Dave Carson?" one officer asked. Dave nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched. "We're here regarding allegations of abuse involving your stepdaughter, Emily. We need you to come with us for questioning." "You can't be serious," Dave snapped. "This is absurd. I haven't done anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance. "We're only asking questions at this stage, sir. But we need you to cooperate." As they moved to cuff him, Dave resisted. "This is a mistake. I'm telling you, you're wrong." His voice cracked, but he stopped struggling when he saw Megan's tear-filled eyes. "I would never hurt her," he said softly, his tone almost pleading. Before anyone could respond, a voice broke through the chaos. It wasn't him. All heads turned to the corner of the room. Mike stood there, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. "It wasn't him," he repeated, his voice shaking. "It was me." The room went silent. Even Dave seemed stunned. "Mike," Dave said slowly, his voice trembling, "what are you talking about?" Mike stumbled forward, his hands trembling. "I did it," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I hurt Emily. It was me." Megan gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Susan's heart pounded as she watched the young man crumble. "Mike, no," Dave said firmly, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're saying. Don't do this to yourself." But Mike shook his head harder. "Stop protecting me," he shouted. "I've done terrible things, Dad. I've hurt her, and I can't take it back." The confession hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. The officers exchanged glances again, stepping closer to Mike. "I was angry," Mike continued, his voice cracking with each word. "I was lonely. You never cared about me, not after Mum died. You didn't even look at me like I mattered. And then you remarried, and Emily, she got everything, all your attention, all your care. His voice broke into a sob. Dave's face crumbled. "Mike, that's not true," he said, his voice soft, almost desperate. "I've always loved you." Mike shook his head violently. "No, you didn't. You were always cold, always distant. I just wanted you to notice me, to care. And then I did. Those things. I thought it would make you see me." He collapsed onto his knees, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't mean for it to go so far. I didn't mean for her to get hurt." Dave fell to his knees beside his son. His hands hovered over Mike's shoulders, unsure if he could touch him. Finally, he pulled Mike into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry," Dave whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to show you. I didn't know how to be a father after your mum died, but I love you, Mike. I always have." Mike sobbed into his father's chest, his entire body shaking. Dave looked up at Megan, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. For what Mike did. For what I let happen in this house." Megan stood frozen, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, pain, and disbelief. She stepped closer, her voice trembling as she spoke. "This isn't just about you, Dave," she said. "It's about Emily, about the damage that's already been done. Apologies won't fix that." The officers stepped forward gently. "We'll need to take both of you for questioning," one said. Dave nodded, his grip on Mike tightening. "It's okay," he murmured to his son. "We'll face this together." As they led the two men away, Megan turned to Susan. Her expression was weary, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" she asked. Susan placed a hand on Megan's shoulder. "We protect Emily," she said firmly, "no matter what." The days after Mike's arrest felt strange, almost too quiet. Susan stood at the window, watching the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The house had emptied out, yet the memories lingered. Every corner held a shadow of what had happened, a reminder of the pain that had filled this place. Mike had been taken into custody and sent to a juvenile rehabilitation center. The decision had been swift, his confession sealing his fate. Susan had watched as they led him away, his head low, his eyes barely meeting anyone's gaze. He hadn't spoken to Megan before leaving. Dave's departure had come soon after. Megan had finally filed for divorce, a decision that had taken all the courage she could muster. He hadn't fought her. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe he just wanted to leave everything behind. In an unexpected move, Dave signed over 2/3 of his assets to Megan. "For Emily," he had said, his voice hollow. "She deserves the best care." Susan hadn't believed it was enough to make up for what he had done. But Megan had accepted it, her focus solely on Emily. Now the house felt like it belonged to someone else. The oppressive presence that had weighed on it was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar. Megan appeared in the doorway, her face softer than it had been in weeks. "Susan," she said, her voice low, "it's time to go." Susan nodded. She grabbed her bag, following Megan out the door. Together, they drove to the hospital where Emily had been admitted. It had been a week since Emily had been moved there. The doctors were optimistic, though cautious. Her condition was stable, and there were small signs of progress. Megan sat by Emily's bedside every day. She talked to her, combed her hair, held her hand. Susan often stayed nearby, offering quiet support. Today was no different. Megan adjusted Emily's blanket, her movements gentle. "Do you think she knows we're here?" Megan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Susan glanced at Emily's face. "I think she does," she said softly, "and I think she's fighting to come back to you." Megan's eyes filled with tears. "I just want her to be happy," she said, her voice trembling. "She's been through so much. I should have protected her better." "You did what you could," Susan replied firmly. "And now you're giving her a chance to heal. That's what matters." The room fell quiet again. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was steady, almost comforting. Megan leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched into her face. Susan watched them, a bittersweet feeling rising in her chest. She had been a part of their journey, their pain, and now She was here for their healing. Hours passed. Megan sat in a quiet vigil, her hand resting on Emily's. Susan read a book, but glanced up often, her eyes drifting to the small figure in the bed. As the afternoon sun began to dip, a faint sound broke the stillness. Megan stiffened, her gaze snapping to Emily's face. "Mama," Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. Megan gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Emily," she whispered. "Emily, I'm here." Emily's eyes fluttered open, just a little, but enough to see her mother. A weak smile formed on her lips. Susan felt her own eyes fill with tears as she watched. She stepped back, letting mother and daughter share the moment. Megan leaned over, her hands trembling as she stroked Emily's hair. "You're safe now," Megan said through her sobs. "I promise you, you're safe." Emily's small hand moved, grasping her mother's. Megan held it tightly, as though she would never let go. Susan smiled, a deep sense of relief washing over her. For the first time in months, she felt hope. The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars would take time to heal. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of a mother's love, it felt like the first step towards something better. As the light outside dimmed, Susan quietly slipped out of the room, leaving Megan and Emily in peace. A soft smile lingered on her face. She knew she would be back the next day, ready to help them rebuild the life they deserved. Stories like Megan and Emily's remind us of the incredible strength it takes to stand up to darkness and fight for a brighter future. It's a testament to how love and courage can heal even the deepest scars. And remember, sometimes being there for someone, just like Susan was, can make all the difference. Thank you so much for watching today. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and let's keep spreading hope, one story at a time. See you soon.